I don't know if this is an Eastern Coast thing, but in my little town, there's a twice the ice station. Basically, you could fill up water jugs in 5 gallons to get bags of ice cheaper than you could get in the grocery store. I went out a few nights ago to get some water because who wants to be drinking tap water? My husband was home, and because I'm kind of heavily pregnant, he insisted that he'd go instead. I certainly wish he would have. It was about 1 a.m., dark for miles and in the middle of nowhere. As I get out of my car, I open the back seat to get the gallon jugs and close the door. As soon as I do, a dark blue truck pulls up perpendicular behind me, presumably so I couldn't get out if I decided to get back in my car. Alarm bells start going off, and the bell starts screaming at me when the slide door opens and 2 quite large men step out. It's about a 20-foot distance between me and them, so the first thing I think of is to pull out my phone. I answered a quote phone call from my husband and answered with a, "Hey honey, yeah, I'm almost home." As soon as they see me answer, one of the guys says something and they both get back in the car and peel out of the lot. I throw my unfilled jugs into the back of the car and lock all the doors a million times or more before I broke down and called my husband. About 2 days later, there was breaking news of a pregnant woman that went missing. She was abducted as her father had sworn up and down that she wouldn't just get up and leave. I know it was the man in the blue van. I told the police all I know. I don't know if they targeted me because I was a woman all alone in the middle of nowhere, but deep down, I know they targeted me because I was pregnant, and I don't want to think about what would have happened to me or my baby. During my early 20s, I worked as a meter reader in Iowa City, Iowa. A meter reader is the person who records as to how much electricity, gas, or water you used each month. If your meters are on the inside and you want an accurate bill, a meter reader must enter your home whether you're there to let them in or not. Just to clarify, we only entered homes if consent was given when the customer first signed up for service. Customers also provided us with keys if necessary. Entering a home when the owner isn't present is something that I never got used to. No matter how loudly I knocked, I never shook the uneasy feeling that I wasn't welcome. The inside of a home is the ultimate private space. A home's exterior is just the image of ourselves that we project to the rest of the world. But the further you venture inside, the closer you come to truly seeing what kind of person lives there. And if you want the raw and unfiltered truth, head for the basement. I hate basements. I've seen walls that look like giant static-filled TV screens until I realized that it was roaches scurrying across a white background. Cobwebs so thick and dusty that it looked like the cotton canning machine exploded at the Spider County Fair. I've seen rats, snakes, weapons, abused pets, homeless squatters, massive hoards, bizarre sexual items, a makeshift meth lab, and even a coffin. There are rational explanations for all these things. Well, maybe not the coffin, but there was this one basement where what I found was beyond the grasp of logic, and that's what made it so terrifying. It was an old apartment house. From the outside, it looked like every other house on the block. I entered the back door and found myself at the top of a staircase. I ran my hand along the wall until it grazed a light switch. I flipped on the switch, but no lights turned on. I wasn't carrying a flashlight, and a typical route involved 5 or 6 hours of walking, so I carried as little as possible. Oftentimes, I used my light from my handheld screen, but that only illuminated whatever was about a foot in front of it. So, armed with the world's worst lantern, I made my way down into the darkness. Once at the bottom, I blindly shuffled across the room, one baby step at a time. With arms outstretched and head down, I eventually reached the far side of the basement. I shined the dim light from my handheld along the wall and discovered 2 doors. Each door led into its own small room. I chose the door on the right and found the meters in the far corner. As I entered the reads, I began hearing noises coming from the other room. Something was moving in there, and there was whimpering that grew louder and louder the longer I listened. I eventually came to the realization that it was a dog. It sounded weak and distressed. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. At this point, the dog was scratching on the other side of the door. I felt so helpless for it. I reported it when I got back to the office, but I couldn't shake the thought of that dog. It stuck with me for over the next month, until it was time to return. So there I was, 1 month later, back within that basement. At least this time I knew where the meters were located. I shuffled back to the little room on the right while keeping my ears open for any sounds coming from the other room. This time I heard nothing. I read the meters and started making my way back, but I couldn't shake the memory of that dog. Was it still trapped inside that room? My curiosity got the best of me. I stood outside the door for a few moments, listening, but still nothing. That's when I made a huge mistake. I tried to open the door. I had no more than jiggled the doorknob when I first heard it. Screams. Blood-curdling screams unlike anything I've ever heard. Sounds that I didn't think a human was capable of producing. Short, piercing, high-pitched screams followed abruptly by a low, drawn-out guttural moan that ultimately morphed into something that I could only describe as crying, but much louder. It was all over the place, like some sort of psychotic freeform jazz. I stumbled backwards, nearly losing my balance. I shouted something like, "Hello? Who's in there?" There was no response, just screams. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Still no response, just those constant screams. There was no doubt that I yelled loud enough for him to hear me. He didn't want my help. He wanted me gone. I fumbled my way through the darkened room toward the exit. When I reached the top of the stairs, I just stood there listening. I was trying to wrap my mind around what I was hearing. I waited for the constant screaming to stop, but it never did. When I finally left, it was still as loud and demented as when it began. I thankfully felt relieved, but that quickly vanished when I realized that I had to do it all over again next month. I ended up reporting what I heard, but nothing ever became of it. As my return drew nearer, a sense of dread grew inside of me. What kind of lunatic sits alone in total darkness and silence? My mind created endless explanations for what kind of hell laid beyond that door. But by the time I returned, I had built him up in my mind so much that anyone other than the devil himself would have been a letdown. But there was no sign of him the next month, or even the next several months. I'd nearly given up on solving the mystery when a stroke of luck pulled me back in. One night, I went to a concert with my friend Laura. After the show, I gave her a ride home. She'd moved somewhat recently, so she had to give me directions. I didn't pay much attention to where she was leading me until she pointed to a house a ways up the street. I couldn't believe it. She had moved into the house with the mysterious room in the basement. This sounds weird, but have you noticed anything odd about the basement at this? I began to ask, but before I could finish my sentence, she blurted out that a crazy guy lives down there. Finally, I had confirmation. She went on to tell me that even though her apartment was in the attic, she'd often heard him yelling late at night. But that wasn't all. She had actually met him. One day, while walking to her car, she saw him standing in the lawn. He stood perfectly still with no expression on his face. He was directly in her path, so she cautiously made her way around him. She noticed that he was staring at her, so she offered a friendly hello as she passed. He had no reaction except for one unsettling exception. He stuck out his tongue, then quickly sucked it back in his mouth and resumed acting like a statue. Thoroughly creeped out, she got in her car and drove away. 2 or 3 months later, I finally met him myself. I entered the back door like I had so many months before. This time, something was different. There was a light on in the basement. I peered down the staircase. At the bottom, a ragged-looking dog was staring at me. It was the same dog I'd heard in my first visit. Then I noticed something else. Behind the dog, I could see a pair of bare feet. The ceiling blocked my view of the rest of whoever was standing there, but it didn't matter. I knew it was him. I should have left right then and there, but I didn't. I know this probably doesn't make any sense, but at this point, my desire to finally get some answers outweighed my fear. I shakily called out, meter reader, and started to make my descent. As I made my way down, more of him was revealed. He looked to be middle-aged. His head was shaved and his eyes were wild. He was wearing pants but no shirt. What I remember most was how lean and skinny his body looked. It had the look of a body that was never at rest. I explained who I was and what I was doing there. To my surprise, not only did he talk to me, but he actually sounded somewhat normal. The volume and pitch of his voice was odd, but he said the same sorts of things that people typically said to meter readers. I even started to doubt whether or not he was the same man I heard screaming, but his behavior slowly removed all doubt. As I read the meters, he rapidly paced back and forth. He was constantly wringing his hands together and spastically cocking his head from side to side. The longer he talked, the more agitated he became. He began grimacing and little verbal tics started popping up in his speech. Every so often, he blurted out a loud noise in the middle of a sentence. He was trying to suppress these sounds, but he was losing the battle. I started to make my way to the exit while he followed. His verbal outbursts grew louder and louder and more frequent. I was petrified. When I reached the stairs, I drew our conversation to an end and said goodbye. As I turned up to head up to the staircase, he could no longer hold it in. Screams. The very same unforgettable screams that I heard coming from the locked room. I ran up to the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me, flung the door open, and rushed back into the daylight. A month or two later, I had a couple friends, including Lara, over to my place. I was excited to tell her about my encounter, but as I was relying on what happened, I could tell that something else was on her mind. When I finished telling my story, she told me about something she'd seen a couple weeks earlier. One day, she noticed lights flashing outside of her window. She looked outside just in time to see police officers placing the man from the basement in the backseat of a squad car. She later found out from another tenant that he had attacked someone with a knife. That was the last we ever saw of him. I don't know what became of the man in the basement. I like to think that he got the help he needed, but maybe that's just because I'd rather not think about the alternative.
This took place at a movie theater in Scottsdale, Arizona when I was around 12. It was 2015 and my mom and I had just moved from Minnesota as my dad had unfortunately left us to go live on his own, and we still don't know where he is. My mom would be my only guardian throughout the rest of my childhood, and things start to get stressful when that happens. My father is gone, my mom is taking care of me, and while we do have other family members, there wasn't a lot that they could do as they lived in other states. Anyway, we had recently found out that there was a local movie theater not too far away from where we lived, and my mother said that she'd take me to see the new Jurassic World movie. I was the type of kid who absolutely admired those movies and any others that had action in them. When we got to the movies, we were in line waiting to pay for our ticket when I noticed a man in a large raincoat sitting in one of the chairs inside. Now, the way that this theater is set up is that the line where you pay for a ticket is outside, so anyone can look at you from inside the theater. However, as soon as we got inside, my mom had used the restroom before we went to go see the movie and told me to wait where she told me. That's when a foul smell hit me in the face. From what I could tell, it smelled like vomit, and I turned around to see the man who I saw earlier. "Hey buddy, what's up?" At this point, I'm officially freaked out and somewhat confused. Trying to be polite, I say a quick hi back and turned away to pretend like I'm looking at the displays. The only problem was that he didn't take the hint for him to leave me alone. "How old are you? Are you lost?" I told him no, and that I was waiting for my mom so we could go get snacks for the movie. After I told him that, he then said something that made my skin crawl. "I like snacks too. I have some candy in my car that you could get for free. Let's go get some." He proceeds to grab my hand, but thankfully my mom then came out of the bathroom and the man immediately lets go of me. I could see him turning red and he began to say things like, "Oh, this is your kid? I thought he was lost. My mom is not the type of person to get into people's faces when she sees something wrong, so she gives him an awkward smile. But I knew that she was thinking in her head to get the hell away from my son. We've been back to that theater since, and thankfully, haven't seen the man.
I was 21, recently became a police officer, and was also recently dumped, so my friend suggested Tinder. As a 21-year-old and new cop, I had the I'm invincible and I could take on anyone mentality. I matched with a very good-looking, out-of-my-league female. We chatted and eventually set up a date to meet. She said that she had a great open field to look at stars and hang out, and we could meet up at her house. So the night came. I was excited, and she seemed to be excited when I picked her up. She guided me to the field, and it looked really nice. Open space, woods, deer, and other wildlife. In the field, I noticed really dim headlights in the distance. Then, a van started driving towards us and pulled up right in front of us, almost close enough to block me from going forward. I told her to stay in the car and I'll go say hi. In the front driver's side of the van, there was a decently sized man. I asked him what was going on and if he could back up his car a little bit. He was very polite and told us that he was the owner of the property, and he said that he didn't mean to scare us. He told me that he's been having trouble with poachers on his property and just wanted to make sure we weren't going to be shooting at anything. I assured him we only came out to look at some stars and wildlife. He was perfectly okay with that and told me to have a nice date and drove away. After that, the girl was texting nonstop. Around an hour later, I saw headlights coming towards us again, this time at a really fast pace. We hopped in the car and I moved into a more defensive position. The same man came close enough to almost hit my car. She hopped out of the car, and at that point, I ran towards the guy. I immediately knew that this wasn't good. I got out and gave them commands to back up and get on the ground. Neither of them complied, obviously. He then proceeded to charge at me and knock me on the ground. Luckily, I was able to get him on his back and get up. I saw my date grab a metal pipe from the van. She told me that they had a gun and to give them money and the truck and that I won't get hurt. Of course, with my I'm invincible mentality, I said no. She started to cry and saying that she didn't want to hurt me. He then started to go back toward the car. At that point, I told them that I was a cop, drew my concealed firearm, and to lay on the ground. After a moment of shock from all of us, they complied. I was able to call 911 and tell them my name and badge number and had two at gunpoint and needed backup immediately. I gave our dispatcher the best directions I could to this field while on the phone, and they both then fled. Again. With my stupid new cop young guy mentality, I chased them. I took off after the man who ran into the woods around the field. I chased him for maybe 30 seconds and then heard 3 loud pops and saw muzzle flash. My I'm invincible mentality went right out the window. I ran like hell back toward my car and peeled the hell out of there. I went back to the area and I picked her up and called dispatch again and had officers come to that location. Of course, the first officers to pull up were my sergeant and my field training officer. Of course, they were both completely understanding and didn't give me any grief about it at all. The most used words were idiot and stupid rookie. I hopped in their car and we went toward the field. Luckily, the van was still there. I was told to shut my mouth and only come out if they started getting shot at. They cleared the area and started looking in the van. They found meth right on the center console and searched the car. What scared me the most was when my field training officer and sergeant came back to the patrol car. They let me out and told me to come look in the back of the van. Both of them were pale. They looked horrified. I went to the back of the van. There were several knives, duct tape, lighter fluid, and a decent amount of rifle ammunition, handcuffs, and what looked to be dried blood. In the front seat passenger side, we found an AR-15 style rifle and 2 more handguns. We called for immediate backup and detectives. When they investigated the blood, it turned out it wasn't blood. The plates had been stolen and the van was reported stolen. I still hate about the whole encounter, but luckily no one got hurt. I will never use online dating again. Ever. In 2016, I went to a McDonald's with my friend who we'll call Ashton for privacy reasons. On this night, we had just seen a movie with his girlfriend, and after the movie, we all got hungry, so we decided to hit up our local McDonald's to go grab a bite. It was nearing midnight, so there were barely any cars out at this time. We went to the McDonald's, ordered our food, and sat down at a table. Ashton and his girlfriend were sitting down facing me, and I was facing them. As we were eating, I see a middle-aged man sitting about 2 tables across from us with a little boy that looked to be about 7 or 8. The thing I remember most vividly about the boy was the extremely empty, pale look on his face. On top of that, he wasn't even eating. He kind of just sat there watching what I assumed to be his dad. At one point, the guy gets up and grabs the boy's hand, and eventually they come to us. The man starts to ask Ashton if he had any spare cash on him. While he was talking to Ashton, the boy looks at me and stares at me with eyes open wide as possible. I'll admit, it was a bit creepy, but what he said next made me want to puke. "That's not my dad. I've been kidnapped. Please help me." My blood turned to ice as I heard him say that. The man then looked at the boy and then at me, and with that, they left out the McDonald's, as I knew that he caught on to my suspicion. Ashton and his girlfriend seemed to catch on as well, and I immediately dialed 911. I explained everything to the operator and gave her a description of the man and the boy. They came, but nothing ever became of it. A few weeks later, I was watching the news, and there was a missing child report that came on. When I saw who the missing child was, I nearly screamed. It was the same kid at the McDonald's. They unfortunately found his body by a canal not far from my house, and at that point, I knew that the man had something to do with this. Apparently, he had been missing for well over 6 months, and police have been searching for him ever since the day he'd gone missing. They aren't sure as to how he died, but the news said that he had died due to dehydration, which I found very false. Ever since that day, I feel so helpless and heartbroken for that boy. There are truly some messed up people in this world that do horrible things. I hope you could use my story to create awareness as to how these things happen all too often, and how you could take action to help make the world a better place. A few years ago, something happened to me during my childhood that shook me for life. Because of this, one of my parents always stayed home with me at all times. We had recently just moved into a new apartment in South Texas, which wasn't the safest area as we were financially unstable and needed a cheaper place to live. One day, my parents had both left to go to a meeting for their work and wouldn't be back for a few hours, so I had the place to myself. I remember throwing myself onto my bed to watch some TV when I heard what sounded like faint knocking coming from somewhere. I dismissed it as it being wind since it was raining out, but that checked out when I heard it again, this time much more louder than before. My 11-year-old self started pacing around the room, wondering as to where it could be coming from. At one point, I dropped the remote and it somehow landed underneath the bed, so I bent down to go get it. I saw the remote, but I saw something else too. There was someone under my bed. Thankfully, they didn't see me as they were facing the opposite direction, but that didn't matter because they knew I was here. With my eyes open wide, I practically ran out the door and ran down the stairs to my friend's apartment door and told his parents everything. They pulled me in and called the cops, and they arrived soon after with my parents not far behind. The only problem was that whoever was under my bed was gone. He simply left through the door. I'm now 16 and we're living in a house in a much safer area.